And what she found on the other side changed everything. A woman laughed at her whole life, a ranch on the edge of ruin, and an enemy powerful enough to bury them both. This is the story of Eliza Hartwell, the woman nobody saw coming. If this story moves you, hit that like button. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one runs deep. A story of courage, ruin, and the land that refused to die. The fire announced itself before anyone could see it. It came first as a smell, something sharp and wrong cutting through the dry August air, riding the hot wind that had been blowing across the Montana flatlands for 3 weeks straight without mercy. Then came the sound, a low, crackling groan, like the earth itself was tearing open along some hidden seam. Then the glow, orange and violent and wrong, blooming above the roofline of the Callaway barn like a second sun deciding it had every right to exist. By the time the ranch hands realized what was happening, the eastern wall was already gone. Fire! Fire! Get back! Everybody get back! Men scrambled in every direction. Boots pounded on dry earth. Lanterns swung wildly in the dark as workers stumbled out of the bunkhouse half-dressed, some still pulling suspenders over their shoulders, faces pale and bleached by panic. The foreman, a thick-armed man named Dale Pruitt, was already shouting himself hoarse, waving his arms at the gathering crowd. "Don't go near it! There's nothing we can do! Let it burn! Let it burn!" The heat was extraordinary. Even standing 40 feet away, the workers could feel it pressing against their faces like an open oven door. Sparks spiraled upward into the black sky. The hay stored in the loft had caught, and when hay catches in a barn that hasn't seen rain in 3 weeks, there is no negotiating with it. There is only retreat. Every man there knew this. Every man stepped backward, except one. She was standing slightly apart from the rest, the way she always stood, not out of pride, but out of long habit. When you've been mocked in every crowd you've ever stood in, you learn to leave yourself a little space between you and the laughter. Eliza Hartwell was 26 years old, broad-shouldered and plain-faced, with hands that were rough from years of work that other people didn't want to do. She was not beautiful by the standards the frontier applied to women, and the frontier had made sure she knew it. She'd heard every version of the joke. She'd stopped flinching at them years ago. But right now she wasn't thinking about any of that. She was looking at the barn, and she was listening. Beneath the roar of the fire, beneath the shouting of the men, and the crash of a burning beam collapsing somewhere inside, she heard something else, something high and terrible and very much alive. Animals. She could hear horses screaming. She could hear cattle slamming against the sides of their stalls in blind panic. She could hear a sound she recognized from the worst moments of her childhood, when her father had taken her to a neighbor's farm after a flood, and she'd heard that exact same sound. Living things that cannot understand why they cannot escape, beating themselves against walls that will not open. "Those horses," she said, but nobody heard her. "The mules are still in there," someone shouted. "And the Callaway mares, all 4 of them." "They're gone," Dale Pruitt said. His voice had gone flat and hard, the voice of a man who had already made peace with a loss and was now in the business of keeping others from making it worse. "We can't go in there. Nobody goes in. You hear me? Nobody." Eliza was already moving. "Hey, hey, hey! Woman, stop! Stop her!" But no one moved fast enough. And honestly, later, no one could quite agree on whether they'd really tried. There was something in the way she moved that gave men pause. Not reckless, not hysterical, deliberate. Like she'd already made a calculation that the rest of them hadn't finished yet. She grabbed a horse blanket from the fence post where someone had left it, dunked it in the water trough beside the barn door in one smooth motion, threw it over her head and shoulders, and pushed through the door. The heat hit her like a wall. Inside, the barn was the world of orange and black. The loft above was fully involved, sheets of flame curling and rolling across the old dry timber like something alive, like something hungry. Burning debris fell in slow arcs. The smoke was immense, pressing down from above, and she dropped lower immediately, moving on instinct, staying beneath the worst of it. The horses were in the first row of stalls. 3 of them, the Callaway mares, were slamming themselves against the wooden gates, eyes white and rolling, nostrils flared. Eliza moved to the first gate, wrestling with the latch. Her hands were already hurting. The metal was hot. Easy, she said. Her voice was steady. She didn't know why. Some deep animal part of her that had learned to be calm in the presence of creatures that needed calm. Easy. I've got you. I've got you. The latch gave. The mare burst out of the stall, and Eliza grabbed her lead, muscled her toward the door. The horse fought her for 3 terrible seconds, and Eliza simply refused to let go, planted her feet in the burning straw, and held on until the animal's panic broke just enough for instinct to take over, for the horse to understand that the open door meant out, meant air, meant away. She released her. The mare bolted into the night. Eliza went back. Second stall. Third stall. A pair of mules in the back corner, nearly insane with fear, that she had to physically push and drag out from behind, bruising her shoulder against the wall, taking a kick to her left thigh that would leave a mark for 2 weeks. A calf that had somehow gotten loose and was huddled in the corner behind the feed bins, too terrified to move, that she picked up bodily and carried toward the door like a child. She made 4 trips. By the time she came out the last time, the western wall was beginning to collapse inward, and a sound like a cannon shot split the night as the main support beam gave way. The crowd outside scrambled back another 10 feet. Dale Pruitt was screaming her name. He'd learned it from someone in the chaos, and he was screaming it like a man who didn't believe it would do any good. Eliza walked out of the burning barn, still carrying the calf. Her hair was singed at the edges. Her eyebrows were mostly gone. The blanket over her shoulders was smoking. There were burns on both her forearms, where the blanket had slipped during the second trip, and her left leg ached where the mule had connected, and she was coughing, deep, racking coughs that bent her double once she was clear of the smoke. She set the calf down in the grass. She straightened up. The crowd was absolutely silent. Every horse, every mule, every calf she'd pulled from that barn was standing in the yard, some being held by workers who had snapped out of their shock and taken hold of leads, some simply standing there in a loose, trembling cluster, sides heaving, alive. Dale Pruitt walked toward her slowly. He was a man who had spent 30 years learning not to be surprised by anything the frontier threw at him, and right now he looked like a man who was failing at that entirely. "What in the hell," he said quietly, "is wrong with you?" Eliza looked at him, wiped a streak of ash from her cheek with the back of her hand. "The animals were still inside," she said, as if that explained everything, as if nothing else needed saying. She had been working the Callaway spread for 4 months, having arrived from a failed farm 2 counties east where the owner had let 3 workers go when the wheat prices dropped. Before that, a logging camp cook position that had ended when the camp closed. Before that, a laundress position at a boarding house in a town she didn't care to name, where the proprietor's wife had taken an intense and personal dislike to Eliza's face and made the professional decision to express it daily. Eliza had a history of jobs that ended for reasons adjacent to her appearance. She was not, by the frontier's definition, what men expected when they thought of a woman worth keeping around. She was large, not soft large, but solid large, the kind of frame that came from years of physical work, from hauling and lifting and doing jobs that were meant for men because nobody else was going to do them. She had a broad jaw and small eyes, and she walked with a slight forward lean, like she was always ready to put her shoulder into something. She wore her brown hair tied back in a practical knot that never aspired to be anything more than what it was. Men at the Callaway Ranch had been creative with their jokes. She'd heard them whispered in the bunkhouse doorway. She'd heard them called out across the yard on slow afternoons, when the heat made men mean and bored. She'd heard the particular laughing silence that fell when she walked past a group of workers, the kind of silence that was louder than any insult. She had learned over 26 years to carry this the way you carry a stone in your boot. You're aware of it always. You adjust your stride. You don't take the boot off in public. You keep moving. She'd kept moving. She was good at her work, genuinely, demonstrably good, with an eye for what needed doing before it was asked, and a capacity for physical labor that most of the men couldn't match. She could read weather better than anyone on the spread. She knew livestock, not from books, but from a childhood spent at her father's knee on a small homestead, learning to watch animals the way her father watched them, attending to what they were telling you with their bodies and their behavior, and the particular quality of their stillness. Her father, James Hartwell, had been a quiet man with enormous patience and an unusual gift. He saw things in land and animals that other people walked right past. He'd taught her to look the same way. to pay attention to small things, to trust what she observed even when she couldn't yet explain what she was seeing. He died when she was 19, of a fever that came on fast and stayed. She'd been on her own since then, and the world had made its position on her status clear, in the quiet, grinding way the world has of making such things known. But she had her father's eyes. And right now, standing in the smoky yard of the Callaway Ranch with the barn still burning behind her, those eyes were the reason every animal was alive. The barn burned down to its foundation by morning. No one slept. The workers formed a bucket line to wet down the fence lines and the adjacent equipment shed, keeping the fire contained through sheer exhausted effort, passing buckets until their arms gave out and then passing them some more. Eliza worked the line alongside the men, and nobody made a joke, and nobody said anything about her face, and for about 6 straight hours, she was just another body holding a bucket. She noticed this. She filed it away in the quiet place where she kept things that mattered. By the time the sun came up, there was nothing left of the barn but blackened timber and hot ash, and a smell that would sit on the property for weeks. The Callaways came out from the main house. The owner, Harrison Callaway, a red-faced man in his 50s, and his wife Margaret, who stood with her arms crossed and her jaw tight and said nothing at all, which was somehow worse than anything she could have said. Harrison Callaway looked at the ruins for a long moment. Then he looked at his workers. Then he did the arithmetic. "I can't keep everybody on," he said. His voice was not unkind exactly. It was the voice of a man delivering a verdict he'd already made peace with. "Not after this. I'll be letting 3 people go. Wages through the end of the week." Eliza was one of the 3. She was not surprised. She had never been surprised by this kind of thing. Dale Pruitt found her behind the equipment shed, rolling her belongings into her travel pack, doing it with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything. He stood there for a moment, hat in his hand, and she could tell he was trying to find words that didn't come naturally to him. "That was something," he finally said. "What you did last night?" She didn't look up from her packing. "Animals needed saving. Callaway should be keeping you on. You saved his best mares. Those horses are worth—" "Mr. Pruitt." She looked up then, steady and without bitterness. "He doesn't want me here. That was true before the fire, and it's true now. The fire didn't change what I look like." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat over in his hands. "Where will you go?" Eliza finished rolling the pack and stood, swinging it over her shoulder. "I'll find something. I always do." She walked 3 miles to the nearest town, which was a small place called Grayfield. A main street, a general store, a livery, a post office, a saloon that was also sometimes a courtroom. She had $13.40 in her pocket, which was enough for a few nights at the boarding house and some meals if she was careful. She sat in the general store the afternoon of her arrival, nursing a cup of coffee that cost a nickel she didn't really want to spend, reading the notices tacked to the board by the counter. Work notices. Auction notices. Lost livestock. A meeting of the Grayfield Water Association next Thursday. A woman offering piano lessons for 50 cents per hour, which struck Eliza as ambitious for this particular town. And then, near the bottom of the board, a notice that had been there long enough to curl at the corners, like it had been waiting and was starting to give up. Help wanted. Mercer Ranch, Ridgeline Road. Immediate position available for capable housekeeper and general laborer. Room and board provided. Must be willing to work long hours in difficult conditions. Experience with livestock preferred. Inquire at the ranch directly. No signature, no name, just the ranch. She read it twice. Difficult conditions. Most employers didn't advertise the difficulty. They hid it until you were already there. Someone who wrote it plainly was either very honest or very desperate. She pulled the notice off the board, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. "Mercer Ranch," she said to the store owner, a woman in her 60s who had been watching Eliza with the open curiosity of someone who sees few enough strangers to treat each one as an event. "You know it?" The woman's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to notice. "I know of it. What can you tell me?" The store owner set down the ledger she'd been pretending to work on and looked at Eliza directly. "Ronan Mercer's spread, out on the East Ridge, maybe 6 miles. Used to be one of the finest ranches in this part of the territory." A pause. "Used to be. What happened?" Drought, same drought that's hit everybody, but it hit them harder somehow. Or, she stopped, seemed to consider something. That's what most people say. Drought. What do you say? The woman studied her for a long moment, something in her face, a decision being made. I say that ranch has had more bad luck than drought explains, she said carefully. Lost 2 foremen in a year, had cattle die that shouldn't have died. Workers quit and won't say why. Ronan Mercer's a good man, stubborn as a fence post and proud as a rooster, but good. Another pause. That notice has been on that board for 6 weeks. 3 people went out to interview for the position. None of them stayed. Eliza considered this. Outside, the afternoon light was going golden across the dust of the main street. How far did you say? 6 miles? The store owner looked at her singed eyebrows and the burn marks on her forearms and the absolutely settled quality of her expression. You're the one who went into the Callaway fire last night, the woman said. Not a question. Eliza said nothing. I heard about it this morning. Henry Pruitt's brother came through. The store owner shook her head slowly. Pulled all those animals out yourself. Someone had to. The woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached under the counter and came up with a paper bag of biscuits. 3 of them, still warm from the morning. 6 miles east, she said, setting the bag on the counter. Road forks after the old Tanner Creek bed. Take the left fork. You'll see the gate. Eliza looked at the biscuits, then at the woman. I didn't ask for charity. No, the woman agreed. You didn't. Consider it the Grayfield Welcome Committee. A small smile. We've been understaffed for years. Eliza arrived at Mercer Ranch the following morning, having spent the night at the boarding house and risen before dawn to make the walk while the air was still cool. The gate was iron, old iron, worked into a design she couldn't quite make out because the rust had been at it for years. A wooden sign hung from the crossbar, Mercer Ranch, the letters burned deep into the wood, the kind of sign someone had made intending to last generations. She stood at the gate for a moment, looking at the property beyond. It was immediately clear that the store owner had been understating the situation. The fields were the wrong color. She'd grown up reading fields the way her father had taught her, and these fields read failure. The grass was yellow where it should have been green, sparse where it should have been thick, and in the low areas there were patches of cracked earth that had given up on grass entirely and gone gray. The fence lines needed mending. She could see 3 sections from where she stood that had posts leaning or collapsed. The equipment left near the barn looked like it hadn't moved in months. The house was sound, at least. A solid 2-story with a covered porch, the kind of house that had been built to mean something, but needing paint and attention the way a man neglects his house when he has too many other things to worry about. A man came out of the barn as she was standing there. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of height that announces itself without effort. Dark-haired, square-jawed, somewhere in his mid-30s, wearing the clothes of a man who had been working since before sunrise and intended to keep working until after sunset. He moved with a certain controlled energy, like someone who was managing a great deal of tension by keeping himself constantly in motion. He stopped when he saw her. His expression was guarded, not unfriendly, but the expression of a man who had learned to reserve judgment. You hear about the position? He called across the yard. I am. She pushed open the gate and walked through. He watched her approach. She was accustomed to this. The moment when people recalibrated. When what they'd expected and what they got had to renegotiate with each other. She kept her pace steady and her chin level. Ronan Mercer, she said. That's right. Eliza Hartwell. She stopped in front of him. He was a full head taller than her, which didn't happen often. I saw your notice in Grayfield. I'm applying for the position. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them blinked. Notice says general laborer, he said. That includes outdoor work, hard work. This isn't a domestic position. I read the notice. You have experience with livestock? I do. What kind? Horses, cattle, mules, goats, pigs, chickens. Some sheep. I grew up on a working homestead. My father ran 60 head at one point. Something shifted in his face. Not softness exactly, but a recalibration of a different kind. He looked at the burn marks on her forearms, then back at her face. Those burns are recent, he said. 2 nights ago. Callaway barn. She didn't answer, which was an answer. He was quiet for a moment. Somewhere behind him, a horse moved in the barn, and he turned his head toward the sound automatically, the reflex of a man attuned to his animals. 3 people came out about this position, he said, turning back to her. One took one look at the fields and left before I could say good morning. One stayed 3 days and then quit without explanation. One stayed a week and then he stopped. Also left. Why? The directness of this question seemed to catch him off guard. Most people, she suspected, didn't ask him that directly. Ranch has been having difficulties, he said carefully. Some people aren't comfortable with difficult situations. I noticed the fields, she said, on my way in, and the fence line, 3rd post from the gate is going to give in the next hard wind, and the 2 adjacent are loose. The drainage channel along the north side of the yard looks like it hasn't been cleared in a season at least. She paused. And your hay barn has a roof section on the eastern end that's lifting. Should be secured before the fall storms. He stared at her. You saw all that from the road? He said. I pay attention. Another silence. A long one. She held it without moving, without filling it, which was the thing her father had taught her. That silence was not empty. That silence was where decisions lived. Finally, Ronan Mercer looked away, looked out over his drought-yellow fields with an expression she recognized. She had seen it on her father's face toward the end. The expression of a man who loves something that is dying and doesn't know how to stop it. Room and board, he said, $12 a month, 6 days a week. Sundays your own. I'll need access to the full property, she said. All of it. If something's wrong with this land, I need to be able to look at all of it. He turned back to her. His eyes were dark and direct. You think something's wrong with this land? I think bad luck doesn't come in this many flavors at once, she said. I think something's wrong. The silence stretched between them again. A hawk turned slow circles above the ridge to the east. The wind moved through the yellow grass. $12, Ronan said, and full access. Eliza nodded once. I'll start today, she said. The Mercer household had not been properly maintained in months, and the evidence of this was everywhere. Not in filth exactly, but in the particular exhausted disorder of a place where all the attention had been directed outward and nothing had been left for the inside. Dishes stacked in the wrong way, floors that were clean but stripped of anything warm, curtains that had come loose from their rods and been left that way, a kitchen that had the ingredients for decent meals but nothing that suggested anyone had taken the time to make one. She'd worked worse. She'd worked much worse. She started in the kitchen because, in her experience, the kitchen told you the most about a household, about its rhythms, its habits, what it had been, and what it had become. She found flour and salt pork and dried beans and a decent iron stove that someone had been maintaining even while letting everything else go, which told her something about Ronan Mercer. He was a man who kept his tools in working order, even when he was falling apart around them. She made biscuits and a pot of pinto beans with the salt pork and a cornbread in the Dutch oven and had it ready when the sun dropped below the ridge. There were 2 ranch hands still on the property, men named Cobb and Garrett, both weathered and quiet, in the way of men who have recently stopped expecting things to go well. They came in with Ronan at the end of the day and sat at the table and did not say anything when the food was set in front of them, but they ate it with the focused attention of people who had been living on something inferior and had not fully realized it until now. Ronan Mercer ate in silence. He watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. She was always looking. The fence line along the north pasture, she said when most of the meal was done. How many posts need replacing? Ronan looked up. 6 or 7. We should do it before the weekend. If the cattle push through again, you'll lose another day chasing them. We're short on posts. I can make posts. There's timber on the east ridge that's already seasoned. I saw it on the walk-in. A pause. Cobb and Garrett exchanged a look across the table. Not mocking, but something else. Something closer to surprised. You can split fence posts? Ronan said. My father could. He taught me. She met his gaze directly. Is there a maul in the equipment shed? There is. Then yes, I can split fence posts. Another silence. Ronan pushed a bit of cornbread around his plate. Outside, the night had come on fully, and the wind was moving through the grass with a sound like breathing. The water situation, Eliza said. Tell me about it. Something changed in his face, a tightening. What do you want to know? Where you're getting your water now, where you were getting it before. What changed? He set his fork down, looked at her for a moment. Then he told her about the creek that fed the property from the north, which had run lower every year for 5 years, and this year had dropped to a trickle. About the 2 wells, one of which had gone dry, the other of which was producing water that tasted wrong, slightly off, slightly bitter. About the old stock pond on the east quarter that had been the ranch's backup in dry years, now nothing but cracked mud. He told her it in the flat voice of a man reciting facts he has gone over so many times they've stopped hurting. But they were still hurting. She could hear it underneath the flatness. "Your father built this ranch?" she said. "Grandfather, 40 years ago." A pause. "He picked this ground specifically, said there was good water under it, said the land held water in a way that most land didn't." He looked away. 40 years the water was here. And now, he stopped. Eliza said nothing. She was thinking about what the store owner had said, "More bad luck than drought explains." She was thinking about the fields she'd walked past on the way in, reading them the way her father had taught her. She was thinking about something she'd noticed, something small, something that was probably nothing. Probably. "I'd like to walk the full property tomorrow," she said. "Early, before the heat." Ronan looked at her. "Why?" "I want to read the soil," she said. He stared at her. "Your grandfather picked this land for a reason," she said. "I want to understand what he saw." It was a long moment before he answered. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, one of the horses shifted in its stall. The fire in the stove popped. "Sunrise," he finally said. "I'll walk it with you." She nodded. She began clearing the plates. And in the back of her mind, in the quiet place where she kept the things she was still working out, she turned over what she'd seen on the walk in. The things she hadn't mentioned yet because she wasn't sure enough of it, because she needed to see more before she said a word. But there had been something. In the northwest corner of the property, where the road bent around before the gate, a patch of ground, maybe 20 yards wide. The grass there was different from the surrounding fields. Not green, not thriving, but different. The yellow was a different shade of yellow, just slightly. The soil, where it showed through, held a different texture at the surface. And 3 plants, she'd counted 3, that shouldn't have been growing in dry soil were growing there. Spindly and struggling, but present. Plants that followed water. Plants that sent their roots down deep and found it even when it was far, far below the surface. Her father had shown her these plants once, on a summer walk across their homestead, when she was 12 years old and the world was still full of things to learn. "Eliza," he'd said, crouching down beside a small, unremarkable plant at the edge of a dry field, "what do you think this is telling us?" She had not known. "It's telling us there's water down there," he'd said quietly. "Not at the surface. Deep. But it's there. The land is never completely empty, Eliza. You just have to know how to listen to it." She stood at the sink in Ronan Mercer's kitchen, washing the supper dishes in water drawn from the remaining well, and she thought about her father, and she thought about those 3 plants, and she did not say anything yet. But she thought very carefully about what she had seen. She lay awake that first night in the small room off the kitchen, a housekeeper's room, barely large enough for the cot and the single wooden chair with a window that looked out over the north pasture. She could see the stars through the glass, clear and cold and vast, the way they only got in high country on dry nights. She thought about the notice, curled at the corners from waiting. She thought about the 3 people who had come before her and left. She thought about a ranch that had stood for 40 years on ground, a man had chosen specifically because of what it held. She thought about the cattle that were dying, the workers who were leaving, the water that tasted wrong. More bad luck than drought explains. Outside, the wind moved through the yellow grass. A coyote called somewhere on the ridge, and the horses shifted in the barn, and the property settled into its nighttime sounds. Eliza Hartwell closed her eyes. She had never had a home. She had worked her way across 5 counties without ever belonging to any piece of ground she'd stood on. She had been mocked and overlooked and left behind, and she had carried all of it in that stone-in-the-boot way, adjusting her stride, keeping moving. But something about this place, this failing, struggling, drought-yellow place, had hooked into something in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. She would figure out what was wrong here. She had her father's eyes. and she intended to use them. She was up before the sun, not from restlessness. She had slept deeply and without dreaming, the sleep of someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it. She rose in the gray pre-dawn quiet, dressed in the dark by feel, and was in the kitchen with the stove lit and coffee on before the first stripe of light showed above the eastern ridge. She heard Ronan's boots on the stairs at 20 minutes past 5. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he smelled the coffee. Just for a moment, a half-second pause that she caught from the corner of her eye, the kind of pause that happens when someone's body registers something better than what it expected. He crossed to the stove without a word, poured himself a cup, and stood drinking it at the window, looking out over the pre-dawn fields. His profile in that light was all sharp angles and contained tension. A man made of held-back things. "You didn't have to do this," he said, meaning the coffee. "I was up anyway." She was already at the table reviewing the rough property map she'd found folded in the kitchen drawer the night before, an old survey, hand-drawn, dated 31 years ago. "I want to understand this map before we go out. Can you show me where the original creek channel ran? The one that fed the property from the north?" He came to the table, set his cup down, looked at the map. His finger moved to the northern boundary, traced a line that curved down from the upper corner, bending around a natural elevation marker someone had labeled Ridge Spur, and then spreading into what the map indicated as a wide, shallow basin in the northwest quarter of the property. "It ran here," he said, "strong enough that my grandfather built the first stock pond right at the basin. Said it was the most reliable water he'd ever seen on open land." His finger moved south. There were 2 secondary channels that branched off and ran through the east and west pastures. Natural irrigation. Didn't need much management. The land handled it. Eliza was very still, looking at where his finger had traced. The northwest quarter. The basin. The place where she'd seen those 3 plants yesterday, growing in soil that should have been bone dry. And the channel stopped flowing. When exactly? Gradually. Over 5 years. He straightened, picked up his coffee again. But the main drop happened about 2.5 years ago. The creek went from low to almost nothing in about 3 months. What changed 2.5 years ago? He was quiet for a moment. She looked up at him. "Hale bought the Fenwick property," he said. His voice had a different quality now. Flatter, more controlled. "The land on the northwest side of my boundary. About 600 acres. Victor Hale?" Something moved through his expression, sharpened it. "You know him?" "I know of him, in Grayfield. The woman at the general store mentioned his name." She hadn't, actually. Not by name. But Eliza had heard it from the man at the boarding house, who had said it the way people say the name of weather they're afraid of. "He buys land." "He buys land," Ronan agreed, the words carrying a weight that turned them into something more than a description. "He buys failing land. He has a talent for appearing right after things go wrong." A pause. "Or right before." Eliza folded the map. "Let's go," she said. They went out into the cold morning, the air at that hour still carrying the memory of the night, sharp and clean, before the day's heat had a chance to settle into it. Cobb was already at the barn, moving with the slow, careful economy of a man working through an old injury, tending to the horses. He nodded at them without speaking as they passed. Ronan walked the property the way a man walks land he loves and is grieving, with the particular combination of familiarity and pain that comes from knowing every inch of something that is slipping away. He pointed out the stock pond, now cracked and empty, the old channel bed visible as a slight depression in the ground, the ghost of water, the places where the grass had given up entirely and the soil had gone to gray powder. Eliza walked beside him and said almost nothing. She was reading. She looked at the angle of the slope. She looked at where water stains marked the old high lines on rocks and fence posts. She studied the plant distribution, what grew where and what didn't, and the 1,000 small things that plants tell you about the ground beneath them if you know the language. And she watched the soil. She crouched frequently, pressing her fingers into the earth, feeling the temperature differential between surface and an inch below, the texture, the density. In most of the property, the soil was dry straight down, warm at the surface from the sun's punishment, equally warm below, the heat penetrating deep into ground that had no moisture to resist it. But in the northwest quarter, crouching in the area near those 3 plants she'd spotted yesterday, she pressed her fingers into the soil and felt something different. Cooler. Just slightly. Just enough. An inch and a half below the baked surface, the soil temperature dropped noticeably. The way temperature drops when you reach the edge of shadow, or when you put your hand near something that retains cold. The way it drops when water is present below. Not at the surface. Deep. But there. She stood slowly. Ronan was watching her. There, she said. She pointed at the ground beneath her feet. He looked at where she was pointing, then at her. There what? The soil is cooler here. 2 degrees at least, maybe 3. And these plants? She indicated the 3 struggling specimens, barely knee-high, unimpressive to any casual eye. These are phaerophytes, deep-rooted. They follow the water table down. They won't grow where there's no water within reach of their roots. There's no water here, Ronan said, not arguing, stating what he believed to be fact, not at the surface. She looked at the land around her, reading it the way she'd been taught. The old channel bed, the basin, the way the slope directed runoff toward this spot across geological time. Your grandfather didn't choose this land because the surface water was good. He chose it because the groundwater was good. Because this land sits over something. She paused. A deep channel. An underground channel that's been running beneath this property for longer than anyone's been counting. Ronan stared at her. She could see him working through it. The skepticism against the evidence, the exhaustion of a man who has been disappointed many times, weighing against the precision of what she'd just laid out. If there's an underground channel, he said carefully, why is it dry now? It's been here for decades. What changed? That's what I want to find out. She looked toward the northwest boundary of the property, toward the hail land beyond it. Show me where the boundary runs. The exact line. They walked the boundary line in the growing morning heat. It was marked by an old fence, very old, the posts gray and weathered, the wire sagging in places but mostly intact. On the Mercer side, the ground continued its drought-yellow struggle. On the Hale side, the land had been worked, recently and heavily. Eliza could see the evidence of earth moving, of deep trenching that had been backfilled, of construction activity that someone had tried to make look old by scattering debris and letting dust settle. She stopped at the fence, looked at the ground on both sides of it. She looked at the angle of the land. She thought about water. She thought about the way water moves underground, following geological channels, following the path of least resistance, moving the way it has always moved through land like this. Patient, certain, bound by physics that didn't care about property lines. This fence, she said. How old is it? Ronan frowned. Old. Been here as long as I can remember. My grandfather put it in. I always figured it was a boundary marker. It's not following the property line exactly, Eliza said. She pointed along the fence's course. Look at where it runs. It bends north here, about 40 feet off the actual surveyed boundary. It cuts across the natural slope at this angle. She paused. This fence isn't following a property line. It's following something else. What? She crouched again, pressed her palm flat against the earth on the Mercer side of the fence, held it there, let herself feel. The soil here was different, compacted in a specific way, and just barely, just at the edge of perception, she could feel the ground was cooler here than 20 feet away. I think, she said slowly, standing, that this fence is blocking the natural flow of the underground channel. Not deliberately, not originally. Your grandfather put it in for reasons he understood, probably to manage grazing, and he didn't know what it was doing to the water beneath. She looked at the line of old posts, running away in both directions. When you block the surface expression of an underground channel, when you compact the soil along a line and push debris against it and let it sit for decades, you change the way the water table responds at the surface. You can redirect where it emerges, or stop it from emerging at all. Ronan said nothing for a long moment. He was looking at the fence with an expression she couldn't fully read, complex and layered and very controlled. And on the Hale side, he said finally, the trenching. They've been doing earthwork, she said, moving a lot of soil. Could be innocent. Land improvement, drainage management, could be something else. She met his gaze. If someone knew where the underground channel ran and they wanted to redirect the water away from your property and toward theirs, You're describing deliberate sabotage, he said. His voice was quiet and very careful. I'm describing a possibility, she said. I'm saying we should find out. She looked at the fence posts. I want to pull 3 of these posts, right here, at this spot. Pull them, break the compaction line, and see what the soil does. He looked at her for a long time. That's our last working fence on the north pasture, he said. If we pull posts and I'm wrong, if you're wrong, I've got cattle with nothing holding them. I know. We'd have to mend it same day, which means I pull Cobb and Garrett off the other repair work. I know that too. He looked at the fence, looked at the land on his side, the pale grass, the dry basin, the empty stock pond sitting useless in the morning sun. He looked at it the way a man looks at a losing hand, asking himself whether there's any play left. If you're right, he said, what do we actually see? Water doesn't appear overnight. No, she agreed. But you'd see the soil change within 24 hours. The temperature differential would increase. The texture would shift. And within a week, she paused. Within a week, you'd have moisture at the surface. Not much, but enough to tell you whether there's something underneath worth digging for. He was quiet for almost a full minute. She let him be quiet. She understood this decision. She understood what it cost to spend the last of your hope on something unproven, how that felt, the particular calculus of the desperate. All right, he said. The word was simple. Everything underneath it was not. They pulled the post that afternoon, Ronan and Eliza working the first 3 together with a post puller borrowed from the equipment shed, Cobb standing nearby watching with the careful attention of a man who had reservations he was keeping to himself. The ground gave up the posts with a sucking reluctance, releasing them with sounds like something sealed being opened. Eliza drove a stake at the breakpoint, tied a rag on it. We watch it, she said. 24 hours. Ronan nodded. His face gave nothing away. They mended the fence 60 feet east of the gap with posts pulled from a section of unused fence line on the south end of the property. A temporary fix, just enough to hold the cattle. It took until late afternoon. By the time they were done, everyone was dirty and tired, and the day's heat had reached its merciless peak. Garrett brought water from the well, and they drank in the shade of the equipment shed. The water still tasted slightly wrong. That faint bitterness Ronan had mentioned, barely detectable but there if you were looking for it. Eliza looked at the cup in her hand. She looked at the well. She filed it away. 24 hours passed, then 48. On the morning of the 3rd day, Ronan walked out to the staked point before breakfast. He came back into the kitchen while the biscuits were still in the oven, and he stood in the doorway, and he was very still in a way that was different from his usual controlled stillness. Come look, he said. The soil at the breakpoint had changed. It was visible, unmistakably, undeniably visible. In the 20-foot radius around where the posts had stood, the ground had shifted. The surface was darker, the gray-yellow dust giving way to something closer to actual earth color. The compaction had released, and in the very center of the breakpoint, where the 3 posts had stood in a line, the ground was moist. Not wet, not flowing, but moist. The kind of damp that spoke of something deep below pressing upward, following the new opening with the patient certainty of water doing what water does. Ronan crouched beside it. He pressed his hand flat against the ground. He stayed like that for a long time. When he stood up, his face was different. Not happy. Not yet. Not with everything still uncertain. Not with a ranch still failing around him. But something had shifted, some small, essential thing. There's water, he said, like he was trying the words to see if they held weight. There's water, Eliza confirmed. They looked at each other across the changed ground. The morning was still, the ridge to the east sharp and pale in the early light, the wind not yet up. Somewhere in the north pasture, cattle moved and lowed with the uncomplicated business of animals that didn't know what had just happened. We need to pull the rest of the posts along this section, Eliza said. The full line, maybe 30 feet in each direction from this point. Break the entire compaction barrier. If I'm right about the channel direction, that should be enough to let the table reestablish. How long? To see real surface water? A week. Maybe 10 days. She looked toward the basin. The old stock pond is still structurally sound. If the water table comes up enough, it'll fill naturally. Ronan looked at the basin. looked at the moist ground, looked back at her. "You learned all this from your father?" he said. It wasn't a challenge, it was something closer to genuine. "My father could read land the way some people read books," she said. "He told me once that every piece of ground is a story. You just have to learn the language." Something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but she was watching, as she always was. "He sounds like he was a good man," Ronan said. "He was the best man I ever knew," she said. And the simplicity of it, the complete absence of performance in how she said it, made it land harder than any elaborate grief would have. Ronan nodded, said nothing more. He had the good sense not to offer comfort that hadn't been asked for, and she respected him for it. They pulled the remaining posts that afternoon. By the end of the following day, the moisture at the break point had spread noticeably. By day 5, Cobb came to find Eliza at the kitchen door in the early evening with his hat in his hands and a strange expression on his weathered face. "There's something happening at the basin," he said. "I think you should come see." The old stock pond had a shimmer at its lowest point. Not water yet, not enough to call water, but the cracked mud at the center had darkened, and the cracks nearest the center had closed slightly, the way cracks close when the earth begins to take back moisture. The land was remembering. Ronan stood at the edge of the pond for a long time, saying nothing. Cobb stood a few feet away, hat still in his hands, wearing the expression of a man watching something he'd stopped believing in. Garrett had come up behind them and was equally silent. Eliza stood apart from all of them, the way she always did, and watched the darkened basin. She was glad for them. She was genuinely, quietly glad. The way she'd felt in the Callaway barn, pulling that calf from behind the feed bins, carrying it toward the open door. The satisfaction of a thing rescued that had been about to be lost. But underneath the gladness, something else was working. Something that wouldn't rest. The well water that tasted wrong. The livestock that had been dying from ailments that didn't match the drought. The 3 people who'd left before her. The earthwork on the Hale property, deliberate and recent and large enough to redirect underground water flows. She thought about Victor Hale. She thought about what the ranch hand at the boarding house had said. He buys land. She thought about the coincidence of a creek that dropped to nothing within months of Hale acquiring the neighboring property. 1 piece of bad luck was misfortune. 2 pieces were a pattern. This ranch had too many pieces. That night, after supper, she asked Ronan about the cattle that had died earlier in the year. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the table. 6 head in February, he said. The vet from Grayfield came out, said it was a stomach ailment, said it happened sometimes with cattle eating drought-stressed forage. He paused. I believed him. I didn't have a reason not to. Which pasture were they grazing? He looked up at her. The east quarter, near the secondary channel bed. The secondary channel. The one that branched off from the main underground flow and ran toward the east, toward the boundary with the Hale property. And the well that went dry, she said. Which one was it? The east well. She kept her expression neutral. She was building something in her mind, assembling pieces carefully, the way her father had taught her to build a picture of what was wrong with land before she said a word out loud. You looked first, you gathered, you were certain before you spoke, because speaking prematurely cost you the chance to be believed when it mattered. She wasn't certain yet, but the picture was taking shape. I want to test the water from the remaining well, she said. Properly. Is there anyone in Grayfield who can do a chemical analysis? Ronan frowned. The assayer's office does some testing. They mostly work on mineral samples, but... He stopped. His eyes sharpened. Why? Because it tastes wrong, she said simply. And if the water tastes wrong, I want to know why. He looked at her steadily. She could see him working through it. The implications. The shape of what she might be suggesting. The particular heavy geography of a suspicion you didn't want to have. You think someone's done something to the well, he said. I think the well tastes wrong, she said again. And I think we should know why, before we form any other opinion. Ronan sat back in his chair. He rubbed one hand across his jaw. Outside, the wind had come up with the night, moving through the recovering grass, and somewhere in the barn the horses were shifting and settling, and the property was breathing around them with the first genuine ease it had managed in years. I'll ride to Grayfield in the morning, he said. I'll come with you, Eliza said. He looked at her. A flicker of something. She thought it might have been the beginning of relief, the kind of relief that comes from no longer being entirely alone with something. He suppressed it quickly, the habit of self-sufficiency long practiced. "Fine," he said. That night she lay again in the small room off the kitchen and listened to the property settle around her, the wind, the horses, the distant sound of the creek, which was moving again. Barely, just a whisper of itself, but audible if you listened for it, the land coming back to life. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Victor Hale, about earthworks and redirection and the specific, deliberate patience it would take to engineer a ranch's slow collapse. About the feed supply that Ronan had mentioned failing twice in the past year, suppliers who suddenly couldn't deliver, contracts that fell through without clear explanation. She thought about the cattle deaths in the east pasture, near the channel that ran closest to the Hale boundary. She thought about the well water. 1 coincidence was misfortune. 2 was a pattern. 3 was a plan. She didn't sleep for a long time. When she finally did, it was with the particular focused calm of someone who has identified the problem and is now working very deliberately on what comes next. The drought was not the enemy. The drought had only been the cover. The ride to Grayfield took an hour and a half by wagon, and they made it mostly in silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of 2 people with nothing to say, but the working silence of 2 people who are each thinking through the same problem from different angles and have agreed, without saying so, to let the other think. The land they passed through told its own story. Other ranches along the road showed the same drought damage as Mercer's, the yellow grass, thin cattle, farmers standing at fence lines with their arms crossed and their faces doing the arithmetic of survival. But Mercer's damage had a quality the others lacked, a specific precision, the kind of failure that fell too neatly along certain lines, affected too consistently certain parts of the operation, as if the disasters had been arranged rather than arrived at. Eliza watched the landscape move past and thought about what she knew. She had been at Mercer Ranch 8 days. In that time, she had learned the property's geography as thoroughly as she could on foot. She had learned Ronan's habits, the early rising, the methodical attention to his animals, the way he carried his worry internally, the way he asked for nothing even when he clearly needed something. She had learned that Cobb's knee injury was old and bad, and that he favored it on cold mornings, but would not mention it. She had learned that Garrett was 22 years old and sending most of his wages to a mother in Wyoming and stayed at the Mercer Ranch not because the pay was good, it wasn't, but because Ronan Mercer was the kind of employer who treated men with basic dignity, which was, apparently, rarer than it should have been. She thought about all of this. She thought about what it meant, the particular thing it meant, that someone had chosen this ranch specifically to dismantle, because now she was certain. She had been careful, and she had been methodical, and now she was certain. "Tell me about the feed contracts," she said, breaking the silence as Grayfield's rooftops appeared on the horizon. Ronan glanced at her. He'd learned in 8 days that when she asked a question, there was always a reason for it, and the reason was always worth understanding. 2 contracts in 18 months, he said. Both with suppliers I'd worked with for years. Both failed at the worst possible time. Once in late fall, before winter stores were in. Once in early spring when the herd needed the most. He paused. Both suppliers told me the same thing, that there'd been delivery problems, that another buyer had taken the available stock. Same buyer? He frowned. I didn't ask. I was too busy scrambling to replace the feed. Did either supplier give you a name? No. A pause. His jaw tightened. You think it was deliberate? I think someone knew when your supply contracts were due for renewal, she said. I think someone bought the available stock before you could. I think they did it specifically to create a shortage at a moment that would hurt you most. She let that sit for a moment. That takes money. It takes advanced knowledge of your contracts. And it takes a willingness to spend resources specifically to damage someone else rather than benefit yourself. That's a lot of assuming, he said. His voice was careful, but she could hear what was underneath it. Not disbelief, but the particular resistance of a man who has been trying very hard not to believe the thing that explains everything. It is, she agreed. That's why I want the water tested first. Because if the well has been contaminated deliberately, if what's making it taste wrong is something that shouldn't occur naturally, then we're not assuming anymore. The assayer's office in Grayfield was a small, cluttered building run by a man named Silas Crane. Thin, precise, with the magnifying glass perpetually around his neck, of a man who had spent decades looking at small things very carefully. He received the water sample Eliza had collected that morning in a sealed glass jar with the professional interest of someone who was always pleased to see something that wasn't another load of creek sediment. "Chemical analysis," he said, turning the jar, looking at the water against the light coming through the window. "What are you looking for?" "Anything that shouldn't be there," Eliza said. Crane looked at her over his magnifying glass. He was the kind of man who formed rapid assessments of people and didn't bother concealing them. "From Mercer Ranch?" he said. Ronan, standing beside her, went slightly still. "You know the ranch?" "Everybody knows the ranch," Crane said, without particular weight, setting the jar on his work table. "Everybody knows it's been having a hard time." He looked at the water again. "I can have results in 3 days, maybe 2 if it's straightforward." "I'd like to know what specifically causes that slight bitterness," Eliza said, "and I'd like to know if it could occur naturally given the geological composition of the area." Crane looked at her sharply. It was a precise question. Too precise, he seemed to think, for it to be entirely innocent. He looked at Ronan. "I'll have it in 2 days," he said. They were back at the ranch by midday. The afternoon was consumed by the ordinary hard labor of a short-staffed operation. Fence work, cattle movement, equipment maintenance that had been deferred too long. Eliza worked alongside the men without being asked to, taking the third section of fence line that neither Cobb nor Garrett could get to. She worked steadily and competently and without complaint, and she noticed that at some point during the afternoon, the sideways looks that Cobb had been sending her since she arrived had changed quality. They were still measuring, but they were measuring something different now. That evening, after supper, Ronan spread a map on the kitchen table. Not the old survey this time, but a current territorial land registry map showing all the property boundaries within 20 miles. He'd had it in the study, he said, though it took him a moment to find it, buried under papers. Eliza looked at the map carefully. The Mercer Ranch sat in the middle of what she could now see was a deliberate geographic pattern. 6 properties on the map had changed hands in the past 3 years, all of them bordering or adjacent to established older ranches. All of them purchased, she checked the recorded owner names, under company names that were different from each other but had a structural similarity that meant something if you were looking for it. Hale Western Land Company, Ridgeline Agricultural Holdings, Montana Frontier Properties. Different names. Same filing address on the territorial records. A law office in the territorial capital she didn't recognize. "He's using shell companies," she said quietly. Ronan looked at the map over her shoulder. "What?" "These properties, all acquired in the past 3 years." She pointed to each one on the map. "Different company names, but the same filing office." She looked up at him. "He's buying a ring of land around the established ranches, surrounding them." Ronan's expression went through several things in quick succession. She watched him process it. The geographic picture assembling itself in his mind, each parcel clicking into place like the pieces of something that had been made to look random. "If he controls the land on all sides," Ronan said, his voice going low and very controlled, "he controls the water sources that feed through those parcels. He controls the access to markets. He controls where the cattle drives can pass. He controls the fence lines that define where the underground water can flow." She looked at the ring of acquisitions on the map, and as each established ranch fails, from drought, from bad luck, from mysterious supply problems, "He buys it up," Ronan said, "at distressed prices, at a fraction of what it's worth." The silence in the kitchen was extraordinary. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. The land breathed in its new, tentative way. "How many ranches?" Ronan said. Not a question exactly, a reckoning. Eliza counted on the map. "At minimum, 4 that have already sold in the past 2 years. 3 more, including yours, that are still holding." She looked at him. "Yours is the largest of the remaining 3, and the one with the most proven water access if the underground channel is what I believe it is." "He wants the water," Ronan said. "He wants the land. The water is what makes it worth having." She straightened from the map. "This is not a land speculator taking advantage of a drought. This is a man who created the conditions for a drought, or amplified them, and then positioned himself to profit from the disaster he engineered." She said it plainly, without drama. The plain statement of it was more devastating than any performance of outrage would have been. Ronan turned away from the table. He went to the window. He stood there for a long time with his hands braced on the window frame, looking out at the property his grandfather had built, the land his family had worked for 40 years. "He poisoned my well," he said, quietly, with a very specific kind of fury, the cold kind, the kind that doesn't raise its voice. "We don't know that yet," Eliza said. "Not until Crane's results. But you believe it?" A pause. "Yes." He turned around. His face was controlled and precise, and there was something behind his eyes that she thought carefully about. Not recklessness, not the hot kind of anger that made men do stupid things, but something focused and determined, and under everything deeply wounded in the way that men are wounded when something they love has been deliberately hurt. "I want to go to the sheriff," he said. "I know you do." She met his gaze directly. "And I need you to hear me when I tell you that we can't. Not yet. He's been poisoning my water. He's killed my cattle. He has been very careful," she said. "Everything he's done has a plausible alternative explanation. Drought, bad luck, market conditions, a property seller who retired, a supplier who had a bad year." She kept her voice steady and clear. "If you walk into the sheriff's office right now with what we have, a water sample that hasn't been tested yet, and a map with some property purchases on it, what does it look like?" He was silent. "It looks like a desperate man inventing a conspiracy because he can't accept that his ranch is failing," she said. It was not kind, but it was true, and she delivered it the way she delivered everything, directly, without cruelty, but without softening it enough to rob it of its truth. "And if the sheriff is compromised, if Hale has relationships in this county that extend to law enforcement, you think the sheriff is on his payroll? I think we can't afford to assume he isn't." She held his gaze. "If we alert Hale that we're looking at him before we have enough evidence to compel action from people he can't reach, federal investigators, the Territorial Land Office, then we lose the element of surprise, and we lose whatever chance we have." Ronan held her gaze for a long moment. She could see the struggle, the pride of a man who wanted to confront what was wrong directly against the intelligence of a man who understood strategy. "What do we need?" he said, finally. "The water test results. Witness statements from the suppliers who lost your contracts, from any workers who left under unusual circumstances. Documentation of every incident, dates, amounts, what was affected, and how." She paused. "And I want to talk to the other ranchers, the ones who've already sold. I want to know what their experience looked like before they gave up. They may not want to talk. Some of them will," she said. "People who've been wronged generally want to tell someone about it. They just need to believe that telling someone will do some good." He considered this. Then slowly he nodded. "Start making a list," he said. "I already have," she said. She went to the small room off the kitchen and came back with the notebook she'd been keeping since her third day on the property. She set it on the table between them. He looked at it, the neat methodical entries, dated and detailed, building a record that stretched back further than a week. He looked up at her. "You started writing this before you were certain," he said. "I started writing it when I thought it was possible," she said. "Because if I was right, the record would matter, and if I was wrong, I'd only wasted some ink." He looked at the notebook for a moment longer. Something crossed his face, something she didn't quite know how to name. She thought it might have been the specific, complicated feeling of realizing that someone had been working to protect something you loved before you even knew you needed protecting. "Eliza," he said, and then stopped, started again. "I need to tell you something." She waited. "When you came through that gate 8 days ago," he said slowly, "I almost didn't offer you the job." She said nothing. I wasn't trying to be unkind, He stopped. His jaw tightened. "The last foreman I had. He was strong and experienced, and he still walked off this ranch because it was too hard. And you?" He stopped again. "I didn't look like I could handle it," she said, without bitterness. "I thought that," he said. He met her eyes when he said it, which she respected. "I was wrong." "You were," she agreed simply. "I'm not going to waste your time telling you how wrong I was," he said. "But I wanted you to know I know it." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. The kitchen held them both in the particular warmth of a room that has been cooked in and worked in and lived in, the warmth of a space that is doing what it was built for. "Get some sleep," she said. "We have work to do in the morning." The water test results came back in 2 days, as Crane had promised. He met them in his office with the expression of a man who had found something he had not expected and was being careful about how he delivered it. "The water," he said, setting his written results on the desk between them, "contains elevated concentrations of arsenic compounds. Not enough to cause acute illness in adults who drink it occasionally, but in livestock, cattle especially, drinking this water daily over months would cause the kind of gradual systemic damage that presents as digestive illness." He paused. "It would not look like poisoning. It would look like an ailment." The silence in the room was total. "Could this occur naturally?" Eliza asked. Her voice was steady. "In certain geological conditions, arsenic can leach naturally into groundwater," Crane said carefully. "But the concentration here and the specific compound, it's consistent with a form of arsenic that's used commercially, in pesticides primarily, and in certain industrial processes." He looked at both of them over his magnifying glass. "This is not a natural occurrence. Someone introduced this into your water source." Ronan sat very still. The controlled fury from 3 nights ago had not gone anywhere. It had simply gone colder and deeper and more precise. "I need that in writing," Eliza said. "A formal report. Everything you found, the compound, your professional opinion on the source." Crane looked at her carefully. "This is going to make someone very unhappy," he said. "It's already made someone very unhappy," she said. "I want to make sure it makes the right person unhappy." Crane prepared the report. They rode back to the ranch with it in Eliza's coat pocket, and the day felt different around them. Heavier and also sharper, the way air feels before a storm. 3 days after the water test results, Eliza rode alone to the Grayfield area homestead of a man named Abe Pullman, who had sold his ranch 8 months ago to one of Hale's shell companies at a price everyone in the county knew was far below what the land was worth. He lived now in a small house at the edge of town, and he opened his door to Eliza's knock with the expression of a man who expected very little from any visitor. She introduced herself. She told him plainly what she was doing and why. He listened. His expression went through several things. He asked her to come in. They talked for 2 hours. Abe Pullman had a very good memory, and he had the kind of accumulated, unspent anger that comes from knowing you've been wronged and having no way to prove it. He told her about the feed supplier who had suddenly been unable to honor his contract. He told her about the cattle deaths, also in the East Pasture, also near a channel that bordered Hale's land. He told her about a worker who had quit abruptly after being offered, Pullman suspected, money to do so, leaving the ranch critically short-handed at harvest time. He told her about a man who had come to his door 3 weeks after the worst of his difficulties began, offering to purchase the property. A polished, well-spoken man who had expressed sympathy for Pullman's situation and presented the offer as a favor, a rescue. "What did he look like?" Eliza asked. Pullman described him. Tall, 50s, silver-haired, with the particular groomed confidence of a man who was accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. "Did he give you a name?" "Victor Hale," Pullman said. The name came out of him like something he'd been holding too long. He shook my hand and looked me in the eye and acted like he was doing me the greatest kindness in the world. His voice was steady, but the thing beneath it was not. I knew something was wrong. I knew it the way you know weather, but I couldn't prove a thing, and my family needed the money, and so I took his price, and I sold him 40 years of my father's work, and I've hated every day since. Eliza wrote it all down. She wrote carefully and thoroughly, capturing every detail Pullman could give her. Dates, names, descriptions, amounts. She asked questions that seemed small but weren't, pulling out the specific details that could be verified against other sources, building a record that was more than just one man's account. When she stood to leave, Pullman walked her to the door. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, looking at her. "You think you can stop him?" he said. "I think we can expose him," she said, "which is the first step toward stopping him." "He has money," Pullman said. "He has lawyers. He has—" He stopped. "He has arrangements with people in this county. You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand exactly what you're saying," Eliza said. "That's why we're not going to the county." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face changed. just slightly, in the way that faces change when someone offers you something you'd stopped believing existed. "Come back if you need more," he said. "I'll tell you everything I remember." She visited 2 more former ranch owners over the following week, both of whom told variations of the same story with the same geographic pattern, the same sequence of disasters, the same well-dressed man arriving with a sympathetic expression and a purchase offer. She built their statements into the notebook alongside the water test results, the property registry analysis, the dated record of Mercer Ranch's own incidents. The picture was no longer a suspicion. It was a case. The night she finished organizing the documentation, she spread it across the kitchen table and went through it once more, carefully, the way her father had taught her to check her reading of the land, looking for the things she might have missed, the piece that didn't fit, the assumption she'd made without realizing. She found none. Ronan came in from the barn while she was still at the table. He stopped in the doorway, looking at the spread of papers, looking at what she had built. "Is it enough?" he said. "For a federal land investigator," she said. "Yes, I believe it is." She looked up at him. "We need to get this to someone at the Territorial Land Office who isn't connected to Hale, someone whose authority supersedes the county." "How?" "Crane knows people," she said. "He mentioned a territorial land agent he's worked with, someone based out of the capital. I want to send a letter through Crane's office, so it doesn't come directly from you and tip anyone off that we're moving." She paused. "And we need to move quickly, because I think Hale has been watching this ranch. I think someone tells him how things are progressing here." Ronan went very still. "You think someone on this property?" "No," she said immediately. "Not Cobb or Garrett. But Hale has been systematic. He tracks his targets. He'd want to know if something changed." She held his gaze. "The water table is recovering. The stock pond is showing moisture. If he has any way of knowing things are improving here, and he'll know we're closer to self-sufficient than we were a month ago. That changes his calculations." "He'll escalate," Ronan said. "He'll escalate," she confirmed. They looked at each other across the table covered in evidence, across the careful record of every wrong that had been done to this land and the people who loved it. Outside, the wind moved across the recovering fields. Water moved beneath the ground with the slow, certain patience of things that cannot be permanently stopped, only delayed. The ranch breathed around them. It was not healed, not yet, not fully, but it was fighting. And so were they. "I'm going to Crane's office in the morning," Eliza said, beginning to carefully stack the papers into their proper order. "I'd like you to stay here. If something happens while I'm gone—" "Nothing is going to happen while you're gone," Ronan said. His voice was firm in the particular way of a man drawing a line. "Ronan." She looked at him steadily. "Something is going to happen. I don't know when. I don't know what form it takes. But a man who has invested this much in destroying this ranch is not going to watch his plan fail without a response." She finished stacking the papers and looked directly at him. "I need you here. I need you watching. I need the animals secured and the workers alert, and I need someone on this property who won't be caught off guard." He held her gaze for a long, charged moment. "Be back before dark," he said finally. "I will," she said. She took the evidence with her when she went to bed. The notebook and all its accompanying documents, wrapped in oilcloth and placed beneath the floorboard of the small room she'd identified on her second day as the one loose plank in the otherwise solid floor. She lay on the cot and listened to the property. She heard the creek, returning to its channel with a sound like something healing. She heard the horses. She heard the wind. She thought about Victor Hale, about the precise, patient machinery of what he'd done, the years of planning, the careful positioning, the way he'd used the drought as cover, amplifying a natural disaster into a deliberate one, the way he'd made every act of sabotage look like misfortune. She thought about how close it had come, how close this ranch had been to joining the others. She thought about the 3 people who had come before her and left. She thought about what they had not been able to see, or had seen and chosen not to face. She closed her eyes. She thought about her father, reading land that everyone else walked past without looking. The land is never completely empty, Eliza. You just have to know how to listen to it. She had listened, and now she knew what was coming. The letter went out through Silas Crane's office on a Tuesday morning, addressed to a federal land investigator named Thomas Aldridge at the territorial capital, a man Crane vouched for with the particular conviction of someone who had known a person long enough to trust them in the specific way the situation required. "Aldridge is honest," Crane had told Eliza, when she'd laid the situation before him in his cluttered office with the oilcloth package of documents on the desk between them. He'd gone through the documentation carefully, taking his time, asking precise questions in the manner of a man accustomed to evaluating evidence. His expression had shifted as he read, not dramatically, but in the steady, incremental way that understanding shifts when evidence is arranged correctly. He's also ambitious enough that a case like this would matter to him professionally. That combination is what you need. "How long before he can respond?" Eliza had asked. "If he takes it seriously? 2 weeks? Maybe 3. Crane had looked at her over his magnifying glass. "He'll take it seriously." She had ridden back to the ranch with the particular feeling of a person who has set something in motion that cannot be recalled, something necessary and right, but carrying its own weight of consequence. She told Ronan that evening and watched his face as he processed what 2 to 3 weeks meant. The interval, the waiting, the continued vulnerability of a ranch that was recovering but not yet recovered, against an enemy who would not stand still. "We keep the documentation hidden," she said. "We keep behaving as normally as possible. We give Hale no reason to believe we're doing anything other than trying to survive. And if he makes a move before Aldridge responds, then we document that too," she said, "and it becomes part of the case." It was not a comforting answer. Ronan had accepted it with the grim pragmatism of a man who was running low on alternatives. The following 2 weeks were a strange, taut kind of ordinary. The ranch work continued, fence repair, cattle management, the daily labor of keeping an operation functional while it rebuilt its strength. The water table continued rising beneath the northwest quarter, and on the 11th day after the fence posts had been pulled, genuine moisture appeared at the surface of the old stock pond. Not enough to call a pond, a thin, dark gleam at the lowest point, barely the size of a dinner table, but real, undeniable. Cobb had stood looking at it for a solid 5 minutes without saying a word. Then he turned to Eliza and said, with the absolute economy of a man who measured every syllable, "I'll be damned." She had almost smiled. The cattle were moved to the north pasture, away from the east quarter where the contaminated well still sat capped and unused. The remaining well's water was being boiled before use, a precaution that cost time and firewood but cost considerably less than watching more animals get sick. 2 of the cattle that had been showing symptoms, sluggish, off their feed, in the way of animals being slowly poisoned without anyone understanding why, had begun to improve once their water source changed. The ranch was healing, but Eliza did not sleep easily. She lay in the small room each night, listening to the property with the focused attention of someone waiting for a sound that isn't there yet. She was aware of how exposed they were. She was aware that a man who operated with the patience and resources of Victor Hale did not simply wait while his plans unraveled. She was aware that somewhere in this county, someone was watching the Mercer Ranch, reporting back, and that whatever picture that report painted was informing Hale's calculations. She had not said all of this to Ronan. She had said enough to keep him alert without keeping him from sleeping, which was a line she walked deliberately. She had said everything she needed to say to herself, in the quiet of the small room, alone. On the 14th day after the letter went out, Ronan received a visit from a man he introduced to Eliza as Frank Delray, a cattle broker who had been one of his regular buyers in better years, a thick, slow-moving man with small eyes and the ponderous confidence of someone accustomed to having things arranged in his favor. He arrived without notice in a good wagon behind 2 good horses and sat at the kitchen table drinking Eliza's coffee with the air of a man doing someone a favor by accepting their hospitality. She served the coffee and stayed at the kitchen counter, moving quietly, the way she had learned to be present without appearing to be attending. "Times are hard," Delray said in a tone that suggested he had said this many times and found it a reliable opening. "Hard for everybody in this region. Man'd be foolish not to consider his options." "I'm considering my options," Ronan said. His voice was flat and even. "Same as always. Word is the ranch has had a rough stretch. Cattle losses. Water trouble." Delray shook his head with professional sympathy. "That's hard luck. Real hard luck." "We've had some difficulties," Ronan said. "I've got a client," Delray said, "who has an interest in this particular parcel. Good faith interest. Serious buyer." He paused for effect. Man named Hale. Eliza did not move from the counter. She kept her back to the table, doing nothing with the coffee things in a way that she hoped looked like something. The silence that followed Delray's statement had a specific texture. She felt it on the back of her neck. I know who Hale is, Ronan said. Then you know he's a serious man, good for his offers, and his offer for this property is… Delray named a figure. It was low. It was insultingly, deliberately low. The price of a man who expected to be negotiating with desperation, which is fair market for the current conditions. The current conditions, Ronan repeated, very quietly. Drought land, Delray said, spreading his hands in a reasonable gesture. Can't expect premium prices for drought land. No offense meant. None taken, Ronan said, in a tone that indicated offense had been taken and catalogued and would be addressed at a time of his choosing. Tell your client I'm not selling. Delray's small eyes moved around the room. They paused on Eliza's back at the counter, moved back to Ronan. Man in your position, he said carefully, might want to think about whether holding on is worth the cost. Man in my position, Ronan said, knows exactly what his land is worth, and it isn't what your client is offering. He stood. The movement was contained and deliberate and communicated clearly that the conversation was finished. I'll show you out. After Delray's wagon had disappeared down the road, Ronan came back into the kitchen. He stood at the window watching the dust settle, and his hands on the window frame were pressed flat and hard against the wood. He's getting impatient, Eliza said. Good, Ronan said tightly. Impatient men make mistakes. Impatient men also escalate. She looked at him. He sent Delray because he wanted to know the state of things here, whether we're weakening, whether we're close to breaking. She paused. Delray's report is going to tell him we're not. Ronan turned from the window. So what does he do next? She thought about the question for a moment. She thought about a man who had spent years building a system of pressure, subtle, deniable, patient, and who was now watching it fail on the one property that was fighting back. He stops being subtle, she said. She said it plainly. She said it the way she said everything, without drama, without softening. But the plainness of it made Ronan's expression go very still and very serious. When? He said. I don't know exactly, but I don't think we have 2 more weeks. She held his gaze. We need to be ready tonight, and every night until Aldridge arrives. He nodded once, and then, without discussion, they went about making ready. The preparations were practical and thorough. Ronan moved the horses from the main barn to the equipment shed, easier to defend, farther from the road. Cobb and Garrett were told enough to understand the situation without being told everything, and both men received the information with the steady pragmatism of people who had already suspected something of this nature without having words for it. I knew something was off, Cobb said. His voice was level, but there was a hardness in it she hadn't heard before. From the start, too many things going wrong at once. Why didn't you say anything? Ronan asked. Cobb looked at him for a moment. Wasn't my place, he said, and I couldn't prove it. A pause. She could. He said it without looking at Eliza, which somehow made it register more clearly than if he'd addressed her directly. They set a watch rotation, 2-hour shifts through the night, one person always awake and outside. Ronan took the first shift himself, from 10 to midnight, walking the perimeter of the main building with the particular alert quietness of a man on his own land who has decided he will defend it. Cobb took midnight to 2, Garrett 2 to 4. Eliza took 4 to dawn. She was awake before her shift began, as she'd known she would be. She went out at 3:45, finding Garrett at the north corner of the equipment shed, scanning the darkness with tired young eyes. Nothing, he said when she reached him. Go sleep, she said. Thank you. He went inside. She stood where he'd stood and looked out at the property in the deep dark before dawn. The darker shapes of the fence lines against the slightly lighter sky, the shimmer that was the beginning of the stock pond's water, the ridge to the east a black edge against black blue. The land was quiet. She listened to it. She had been standing there for 20 minutes when she smelled it. It came on the wind from the south. Just a trace of it, just the ghost of a smell that her body recognized before her mind consciously identified it. Something sharp and mineral and wrong in a way that hit the back of her throat with a familiarity that went all the way down to reflex. Fuel. She moved without hesitation, crossing to the barn at a controlled jog, keeping low, staying away from the silhouette of the open yard. She went in through the side door and up the ladder to the hayloft, the highest point on the property, the one vantage from which the south approaches could be seen. She looked out the loft window. There were 3 of them, moving along the south fence line, staying low, carrying between them the unmistakable profiles of fuel cans, the kind of large, flat-sided cans used for field work, heavy enough that the men moved with a slight forward lean under their weight. They were moving toward the main barn, spreading apart as they approached, one angling toward the equipment shed, the pattern of their movement making their intention unambiguous. She was back down the ladder and running across the yard toward the house before her mind had finished articulating what she'd seen. She hit Ronan's door with the flat of her hand. 3 hard, deliberate knocks. He was awake in seconds. She heard it, the immediate alertness of a man who had not really been sleeping. 3 men, south fence, fuel cans. Her voice was low and completely controlled. Coming for the buildings. She heard him moving. She was already heading for Cobb's door. What happened next moved fast and in pieces, the way dangerous things happen. Not cinematic and sequential, but overlapping and loud and requiring every decision to be made before the thinking finished. Ronan came out of his room with a rifle that he handled with the familiarity of a man who had grown up with one. He went out through the kitchen door without a word, circling around the far side of the house to come at the south approach from the west. Eliza had told him where the 3 men were, and she had told him this without suggesting what to do about it, because she had learned in the past month that Ronan Mercer had excellent instincts and needed only information to act on them effectively. Cobb emerged from the bunkhouse with an expression that had none of the sleepiness of a man just woken. He had been waiting for this too, she realized, in his own quiet way. He had a shotgun that he'd had the foresight to leave propped against the bunkhouse wall. Garrett was behind him. "The equipment shed," Eliza said to Cobb. "The one who broke away to the left. He's going for the shed and the horses." Cobb moved. He was faster than she would have expected given the bad knee. What she heard next was not a battle. It was not the elaborate exchange of a story. It was loud and brief and resolved with the abruptness of situations where one side has the element of surprise and the other side has committed to an action they can no longer retreat from. She heard Ronan's voice carry across the dark yard. Not a shout, but a loud, clear statement. "I see you. Don't move. Don't move an inch." She heard a can hit the ground. Heavy. The sound of a man who has decided that what he was being paid was insufficient to the risk he was now facing. She heard Cobb's shotgun, not discharged, but racked. The particular mechanical sound of a firearm being readied carries its own message in the dark, and the message was received. She heard the 3rd man trying to run, and she heard Garrett cut him off at the fence line with a speed that surprised everyone present, including Garrett. 3 men. On the ground inside the property fence. 2 fuel cans uncapped, the smell of it strong and flat and ugly in the night air. A 3rd can that had been dropped when Ronan had made himself known, leaking into the dry soil near the corner of the main barn. In the lantern light that Eliza brought from the house, the 3 men resolved into their particulars. None of them were from Grayfield. She'd become familiar enough with the county's faces to be fairly certain of this. They were hired men, and they had the look of hired men. Professionals of a specific kind, experienced enough to have done this sort of work before, but not experienced enough in this specific moment to have planned for resistance. "Don't say anything," the oldest of the 3 said to the others, with the calm of a man following a protocol. "Not a word." "That's all right," Eliza said. She was standing with the lantern looking at all 3 of them with an expression that was entirely composed. "You don't have to say anything. We already know what we need to know." Ronan looked at her across the lantern light. "We tie them," she said. "Secure them in the equipment shed. And we send Garrett to Grayfield right now, tonight, for the sheriff." She paused. "Not because I trust the sheriff, but because his arrival creates a record, a public record, and because the evidence of what these men came here to do, the cans, the position they were found in, the fuel on the ground, that evidence needs to be formally recorded before anyone has the chance to make it disappear." Ronan understood immediately. He looked at Garrett. "Ride hard." Garrett was on a horse and into the dark inside of 4 minutes. They secured the 3 men in the equipment shed with rope from the barn. Firmly, without cruelty. but without excessive gentleness. Eliza took the lantern and went around the south side of the building, crouching near the spilled fuel, and found what she'd hoped to find: boot prints. 3 sets, distinguishable by size and sole pattern. She marked the perimeter of them with fence stakes pushed gently into the soil, creating a boundary that could not be accidentally obscured before morning light made them properly visible. She looked at the fuel cans. One bore a marking she recognized, a supply company stamp, the kind of identifying information that connected a purchase to a buyer if you could trace it. She took note of the stamp. She wrote it in her notebook by lantern light, crouching in the dark beside the evidence of what had almost happened to the place she had lived for exactly 1 month and had no intention of leaving. The sheriff arrived at just after 6 in the morning. A broad, slow-moving man named Elias Cord, who took in the situation with careful eyes and whose expression revealed very little. He looked at the 3 secured men. He looked at the fuel cans. He looked at the boot prints in the soil, still clearly visible in the morning light within the perimeter Eliza had marked. He looked at Eliza. "You're the new hire," he said. "I am," she said. "You found them?" "I was on watch. I smelled the fuel before they reached the buildings." He looked at the cans, at the soil stained dark where one had been dropped and leaked, at the main barn standing intact behind them, 12 feet from where the nearest can had been positioned. "These men say anything?" he said. "No," Ronan said. "Not a word." The sheriff walked slowly around the scene, and she watched him with the specific attentiveness she had applied to every important person she'd encountered in the past month, reading what his body said about what his mind was doing. He was, she thought, genuinely processing what he saw. He was not, she thought, happy about it. "I'll need to take these men in," he said, "and I'll need statements from everyone present." "Of course," Eliza said. "I've already written mine." He looked at her again. She held out the written statement, prepared in the early hours while they were waiting, 3 pages in her careful hand, detailed and specific and constructed with the awareness that every word in it might eventually be read by people with authority she could not predict. He took it, read the first page, read the second. His face remained controlled, but his reading pace slowed in the way that reading slows when something commands genuine attention. "You work fast," he said. "The situation called for it," she said. Sheriff Cord took the 3 men to Grayfield. He took the fuel cans. He took Eliza's statement and the statements of Ronan, Cobb, and Garrett, each provided in writing. He left with the stiff professional discomfort of a man who has found himself in the middle of something larger than he'd understood when he rode out here. Whether he was honest or compromised, the record now existed. That was all she had needed from him. Ronan watched the sheriff's wagon until it disappeared, then turned to look at the ranch around him. The morning was bright and clean, the air still cool, the eastern ridge sharp against a cloudless sky. The stock pond caught the light from its growing surface. "He'll know it failed," Ronan said. "By tonight," Eliza agreed. "Probably sooner. And when Aldridge gets here with the documentation we sent, plus the water test report, plus the witness statements from Pullman and the others, plus the formal arrest record of 3 men caught on your property with fuel cans." She looked at him. "The fuel cans are important, because this is the first time Hale has done something that can't be explained away as bad luck. This is the first time there are bodies. Hired hands sitting in a jail cell who, if the sheriff puts enough pressure on them, may decide that their employer's protection is worth less than they were told." Ronan was quiet for a moment. He looked out over the property. He looked at it the way she had seen him look at it on the first morning, with the grief of a man watching something he loves struggle. But this morning the look was different. Underneath the worry, underneath the weariness of a fight that had gone on too long, there was something that had not been there a month ago. "When my grandfather built this ranch," he said slowly, "he told my father there would be days when the land would ask you for more than you thought you had." He paused. "My father told me the same thing." Eliza said nothing. She waited for what came after. "I think I understand now what they meant," he said. "It's not just the land asking." He turned to look at her directly. "It's the people on it, asking you whether you're going to hold." She looked back at him steadily. In the early morning light, with the evidence of last night's near disaster still in the soil around them, and the water in the stock pond catching the sun, and the ridge standing solid to the east, She felt something she did not have a fully developed name for, something that had been building for 4 weeks in the particular way that things build when you are too busy surviving to notice them accumulating. "You held," she said. "We held," he said. The correction was quiet. It was not a grand declaration. It was simply the adjustment of a single word, from singular to plural, that changed the map of things considerably. She looked away before he could see what happened in her face when he said it. "The hands need breakfast," she said, "and the cattle need moving back to the east pasture. The well's capped. The grass is better there." She was already moving toward the kitchen, and someone should check the south fence for damage from last night. Eliza. She stopped, turned. He was looking at her with an expression that was completely unguarded in a way she had not seen on his face before. Not the controlled competence of a man managing a crisis, not the careful stoicism of someone protecting themselves from disappointment. Something underneath all of that. Something that had been there for a while, she thought, and was only now coming to the surface because he had run out of reasons to keep it down. "Thank you," he said. Just that. 2 words, but delivered with the full weight of everything that had happened in 4 weeks on this land placed behind them. She looked at him for a long moment. "Make sure Cobb rests that knee today," she said. "He's been favoring it since midnight." She went inside. She put the coffee on. She began the biscuits with the steady, practiced hands of someone who has found, without fully intending to, the place where her work means something. Outside, she heard Ronan moving across the yard, heard the familiar pattern of his morning, the barn door, the horses, the particular quality of the sounds of a ranch being tended by the man it belonged to. She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. She worked it slowly. She thought about 2 to 3 weeks. About Thomas Aldridge at the territorial capital, reading a letter that laid out a years-long pattern of land fraud and sabotage with the meticulous care of someone who understood exactly what it would need to be believed. She thought about 3 men in a jail cell in Grayfield. She thought about Victor Hale, wherever he was this morning, receiving word that his plan had failed in a new and significant way, that this time there were witnesses, there was a sheriff, there were statements and evidence that existed in the public record. She thought about what a man like that did next, and she thought, as she always did when she thought about that particular question, that whatever he did next, she intended to be ready for it. The biscuits went in the oven. She wiped her hands on the dishcloth. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out over Mercer Ranch in the clear morning light. The recovering fields, the growing pond, the solid ridge to the east, the fence lines that were straighter than they'd been a month ago because she had spent afternoons with a maul and a wedge making them so. She looked at it the way her father had taught her to look at land. And for the first time since she had pushed open that iron gate and walked through it, she thought, this is somewhere worth staying. Thomas Aldridge arrived on a Wednesday, 18 days after the letter went out through Silas Crane's office. He came with 2 men, quiet, efficient men who wore their authority in the understated way of people who don't need to announce it. And he came in a good wagon with federal documentation folded in an interior coat pocket, which he produced at the kitchen table of Mercer Ranch within 10 minutes of sitting down, setting it between himself and Ronan with the practiced economy of a man who understood that time mattered. He was younger than Eliza had expected, 35 at most, lean-faced, with the kind of steady gray eyes that read a room quickly and missed very little. He looked at the documentation she had assembled, the water test report, the property registry analysis, the witness statements from Pullman and the other former ranch owners, the dated incident record she had kept from her 3rd day on the property, the formal arrest report from Sheriff Cord, and he read it the way Crane had read it, with that same progressive slowing of pace that meant something in the text was demanding genuine engagement. He read for 40 minutes. Nobody spoke. When he finished, he set the last page down and looked up. He looked at Ronan, then he looked at Eliza. "You assembled this," he said to her. "Not a question." "Yes." "You have formal training in land law, investigation?" "No," she said. "I have a notebook, and I pay attention." He considered that for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. A recalibration, she recognized, the same kind she had watched happen in Ronan's face on that first morning at the gate. The adjustment between what was expected and what was actually present. "The chemical analysis from Crane," Aldridge said, tapping the water report. "This is the linchpin. Deliberate arsenic contamination of a water source is a federal offense under territorial land statutes. It crosses from civil fraud into criminal territory, which changes everything about what authority I can bring to bear. He looked at Ronan. I need to be honest with you. What I have here is enough to open a full federal investigation. It is not yet enough for immediate arrest. That will require field verification of the property evidence and the testimony of those 3 men currently held in Grayfield. The 3 men won't talk, Ronan said. One of them already has, Aldridge said. The silence that followed was complete. The youngest one, Aldridge continued, with the neutral delivery of a man sharing a professional development. He contacted the county attorney's office yesterday morning through the jail. He's prepared to provide a full account in exchange for consideration of his charges. A pause. He names Hale directly. He names the intermediary who hired them. He describes 3 previous operations on other properties in this county, 2 of which match incidents reported by your witness, Abe Pullman. Ronan set his hands flat on the table. Eliza watched him absorb this. Watched him feel the specific thing that happens when a weight you've been carrying for a very long time begins, in a single definitive moment, to lift. When? Ronan said. We move on Hale's office in the territorial capital tomorrow morning. His primary residence, the Ridgeline Agricultural Holdings office, and the law firm that serves as filing agent for his shell companies. Simultaneously, so no party can alert the others. Aldridge looked at both of them steadily. I need you both available for formal statements. I may need you to travel to the capital within the next 2 weeks. Whatever you need, Ronan said. Aldridge looked at Eliza. She nodded once. He gathered the documents, her documents, the assembled record of everything she had observed and gathered and understood, and placed them carefully inside his case. He stood, and his 2 men stood with him, and they left the kitchen with the brisk purposefulness of people who had the next 18 hours mapped out and intended to use every one of them. Ronan and Eliza sat at the kitchen table after they'd gone. The afternoon light came through the window at the long, golden angle of a day moving toward its end, falling across the table, across her hands, across the grain of the old wood that had held 40 years of this family's meals and problems and decisions. It's happening, Ronan said, quietly, as if saying it too loudly might frighten it away. It's happening, she confirmed. He looked at her. In the gold afternoon light, his face had a quality she hadn't seen in it before. Not the controlled tension of a man managing a crisis, not the grief of watching something beloved collapse. Something that was on the other side of both of those things. Something that required more courage to show than either of them, because it was the face of a man allowing himself to believe something good. I don't know how to... He started and then stopped. Don't, she said, not unkindly. He looked at her. There's still work to do, she said. Let's finish it first. A corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. It was the closest thing to a real smile she'd seen on him, and it was directed at her, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest in a way she did not examine too closely. Right, he said. Work first. They went back to work. What came next was not a single dramatic moment, but a sequence of them, spread across 2 weeks that moved with the suspended, slightly unreal quality of time, during which everything is in motion and none of it has landed yet. Aldridge's operation executed exactly as he had described, the simultaneous action on 3 locations that gave no party the chance to warn another. Federal agents arrived at Hale's territorial capital office on a Thursday morning, while Hale himself was in a meeting with 2 lawyers who would spend the next several years regretting the professional relationship. Financial records were seized, correspondence was seized. A ledger kept by Hale's personal secretary, a meticulous woman who had, it emerged, been documenting her employer's activities for reasons of her own for the past 14 months, proved to be the single most devastating piece of evidence in the entire case. Eliza heard about the secretary later through Aldridge and felt a specific recognition. A woman who paid attention, a woman who wrote things down, a woman who understood that the record would matter. Hale was arrested on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, the news had reached Grayfield, and by Friday morning, the entire county had the story in the particular thorough way that news travels in small communities, complete, detailed, and carrying the specific electricity of something that people had half suspected without daring to fully believe. Silas Crane stopped Eliza on the main street of Grayfield that Friday morning. She had ridden in for supplies. and shook her hand without preamble. "I've been in this county 30 years," he said. "I knew something was wrong. I couldn't see the shape of it." He looked at her with his magnifying glass around his neck and his precise eyes, and something in them that was very close to gratitude. "You saw the shape of it." "I had good information," she said. "You were part of that." "I provided a water test," he said. "You built everything else." He released her hand. "Your father taught you well." She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was bright on the main street of Grayfield, and the air was already warm with the promise of a clear day, and the words sat on her in the way that the right words sit. Not painlessly, but cleanly. "Yes," she said. He did. The store owner, whose name Eliza had learned over several weeks of supply runs, was Margaret Howell, was behind her counter when Eliza came in, and she looked up from her ledger with an expression that had a warmth in it that had been building for weeks. "Word came this morning," Margaret said. "About Hale." Word travels fast. In a town this size, bad news travels fast and good news travels faster. She set the ledger down. "I want you to know something. That notice, the one you took off my board, the Mercer notice, I almost took it down the week before you came in. I thought there wasn't anyone left to answer it." She held Eliza's gaze. "I'm glad I left it up." Eliza looked at her for a moment. "So am I," she said. The 2 weeks of investigation and formal proceedings required exactly what Aldridge had said they would: sworn statements, a trip to the territorial capital for both Ronan and Eliza, formal depositions taken in rooms that smelled of government paper, and the particular institutional weight of official process. Ronan had not been comfortable in those rooms, she could tell. He was a man of open land and physical work, and the legal architecture of what was happening to his enemy was a foreign language he navigated with effort. She translated quietly when she could, explaining procedures, anticipating questions, keeping the thread of what was happening legible for him. In the capital, people looked at her. Not the way people usually looked at her. Not with the dismissive assessment she had worn like a second skin since girlhood. They looked at her because she was the person who had assembled the case. Because Aldridge had introduced her, in the formal rooms of federal process, as the individual whose documentation had made the investigation possible. Because in those rooms, what she had done was a fact that preceded her and defined the space around her before she'd said a word. She was not sure at first how to occupy that kind of attention. She had spent 26 years learning to be invisible, learning to make herself smaller than her frame and quieter than her mind and less than what she was, because the world had consistently made clear that less was what it preferred from her. But in the Capitol, in those federal rooms, she stood at her full height and spoke with her full voice and said what she knew with the precision of someone who had been careful enough to deserve the confidence she was expressing. And the people in those rooms listened. They wrote things down. They nodded. They asked her to clarify, and she clarified, and they wrote that down too. She found to her own slight surprise that she was not afraid. On the last evening in the Capitol, she and Ronan had supper at a small restaurant near the Federal Building. A real restaurant, not a boarding house table, with a menu on a card and a lamp on each table, and food that was considerably better than anything either of them had eaten in the past 2 months. It felt slightly formal, slightly outside ordinary life, like a space set apart from everything that had preceded it. Ronan sat across the small table and looked at her with that unguarded expression she had first seen the morning after the attack, the one that had been making more frequent appearances since then, the one that seemed to have given up arguing with itself about whether to exist. "I want to say something," he said, "and I'd like you to let me finish before you redirect me to a task that needs doing." She folded her hands on the table and said nothing, which he had learned to read as agreement. "When you came through that gate," he said, "I told you $12 a month and full access to the property. That was the arrangement." He paused. "It isn't the right arrangement anymore, and I'd like to talk about what the right one is." She looked at him steadily. Under the table, her hands were very still. "What did you have in mind?" she said. "A partnership," he said. The word came out carefully, the way he said things that mattered, precisely, without ornamentation. Not hired labor, not even a foreman position, though that's closer. A genuine partnership in the operation of the ranch. Equal say in decisions. Shared stake in what it becomes. He held her gaze. "The ranch was saved because of what you did, what you saw, what you built, and protected and refused to give up on. He paused. The least honest thing I could do is continue paying you $12 a month and pretending that's proportionate. She was quiet for a moment. The restaurant moved around them. The low sound of other conversations, the clink of glasses, the lamp making warm circles on the white tablecloths. "That's a significant offer," she said. "It's an accurate offer," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him, at the direct dark eyes that had assessed her at the gate 6 weeks ago and found her wanting, and that had been revising that assessment every day since with the integrity of a man who was genuinely willing to be wrong, at the face that had carried grief and exhaustion and stubborn love for a piece of land for longer than she'd known him, and that was now carrying something else alongside all of that, something that was the specific shape of hope directed at a specific person. "I want to build the water system properly," she said. "The underground channel needs to be properly opened along its full length, not just the fence line section. That's a major earthworks project. It would take most of the winter." He blinked. Then slowly, he understood that this was her answer, that she was already inside the future he'd offered, already working on what came next. He understood this, and something in his face settled into a quality of rightness that she felt across the table like warmth from a fire. "We'll start planning it in November," he said, "after the fall work." "I'll need Cobb and Garrett properly compensated," she said. "They stayed through the worst of it. That means something." "Agreed. And the east well needs to be properly remediated, not just capped. The soil around it has arsenic contamination that could leach back into the water table if it's not addressed. I'll talk to Crane about the right process." She nodded. She picked up her fork. She ate for a moment in the comfortable silence of two people who have reached an agreement that required no further words. Then, quietly, she said, "Thank you for seeing it." He looked at her across the lamplit table. "Took me longer than it should have," he said. "Most things do," she said. "That doesn't make them less true when they arrive." They rode back to the ranch the following morning, and the ride was different from the one that had brought them to the capital. Easier in the body of it, the silence carrying something lighter. The land they passed through was the same land, technically, the same drought damage on other spreads, the same late-season yellow of unprepared fields. But at the edge of Mercerland, the change was visible even from the road. The grass in the north quarter was green, not uniformly, not the lush green of a wet year, but genuinely, meaningfully green in the areas near the recovering water table. The east pasture showed growth along the channel line. The stock pond caught the morning light on a surface that was now unmistakably a pond. Not full, not what it would be in a year, but real water, standing, reflecting the sky. Ronan stopped the wagon at the gate. The iron gate with its rusted design and the wooden sign that said Mercer Ranch in letters burned deep enough to last generations. He looked at it for a moment. She let him look. "My grandfather drove through this gate for the first time in the spring of 1849, he said. "He wrote about it in a letter to my grandmother. He said he felt something when he came through it, like the land recognized him." He was quiet. "I've always thought that was the kind of thing people say. That doesn't mean anything specific." She looked at the gate, at the property beyond it, at the water and the green grass and the ridge standing clean against the October sky. "I think some land knows what it needs," she said, "and waits for it." He looked at her then, and the look was long and clear and carried everything that neither of them had said in the direct terms that people say such things, and she held it without looking away. Then he clicked the horses forward, and they drove through the gate and onto the land that was theirs. The months that followed built themselves one upon the other with the sturdy, undramatic momentum of genuine recovery. The formal proceedings against Victor Hale moved through federal process with the methodical weight of institutional justice, slow, thorough, and ultimately complete. Financial fraud spanning 9 years across 11 properties. Environmental crimes, conspiracy, and racketeering. The law firm that had served as filing agent for his shell companies lost 3 partners to disbarment. The cattle broker Frank Del Rey, who had sat at Ronan's kitchen table and offered a price designed to insult, cooperated fully with investigators and received the kind of consideration that cooperation earns, which was modest but humiliating. Hale himself faced trial in the territorial capital in the following spring. Eliza did not attend. She was not required to, and she had work to do. She heard from Aldridge that Hale had, in the courtroom, displayed the same groomed confidence with which he had operated everywhere, right up until the moment the ledger kept by his secretary was entered into evidence, at which point the confidence had rearranged itself into something less comfortable. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. The verdict was what the evidence demanded. Abe Pullman wrote Eliza a letter after the verdict came down. It was brief. Pullman was a man of few written words, as it turned out, but the last line of it stayed with her. "I told my father's land goodbye when I sold it," he wrote. "I don't know if I can get it back. But knowing the man responsible is being held to account for it makes the goodbye feel different. Less like a defeat, more like the end of a fight I didn't know I'd been winning." She kept the letter. The water project took most of the winter, as she'd predicted. She designed it herself, working from the Geological Survey she'd had Crane help her access from the Territorial Records Office, a proper survey showing the full extent of the underground channel as it had been mapped 30 years ago by a government surveyor who had documented it with the thoroughness of a man who understood what it meant. The channel ran further than she'd realized, not just through the northwest quarter and down to the basin, but extending in a broad arc beneath the eastern portion of the property as well, explaining the good grazing that the east pasture had historically provided and the particular grief of watching the cattle suffer there when the water table had dropped. She marked the work plan in stages. Ronan worked it with her, and Cobb and Garrett, and 2 new hands they brought on in November. So, young men, brothers from a homestead to the south that had genuinely failed to drought, and who came with their own accumulated hard knowledge of land and animals, and worked with the grateful intensity of people who have been given a second chance and understand what that means. The work was cold and hard, and deeply satisfying in the specific way that work is when you understand exactly why you are doing it. By February, the underground channel was fully opened along its natural course. The water table responded the way her father would have predicted, with patient geological certainty, without drama, simply rising to what it had always been. The stock pond filled completely by the end of February, a month early. By March, the secondary channels had enough subsurface moisture to show green shoots along their lines even before the spring rains came. When the spring rains did come, the land was ready for them in a way it hadn't been in years. Soil that held moisture properly, channels that directed it correctly, a water table that received it and kept it rather than letting it run off drought-hardened earth. The fields turned green with the focused intention of land that has the foundation to support what grows on it. Cobb stood at the edge of the north pasture one morning in April, looking at grass that came to his knee, and said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to Eliza, who was standing nearby checking the fence line. "I've been on this ranch 11 years, he said. "This is what it used to look like." She looked at the grass, at the cattle moving through it. The herd was growing again, new animals acquired carefully through the winter as the finances stabilized. At the ridge to the east, where the morning light was doing something extraordinary with the color of the rock. "Is it what it looked like?" she said. "Or is it better?" He thought about that seriously, which was the only way Cobb thought about anything. "Better," he decided. "Foundation's better. We know what's under it now." She nodded. She went back to the fence line. The community's relationship with Eliza Hartwell changed the way rivers changed their courses. Not all at once, but incrementally, following the path of least resistance toward something that had always been inevitable once the right pressure was applied. The people of Grayfield and the surrounding county had known her first as the woman who had gone into the Callaway barn fire, then as the new hire at the failing Mercer Ranch. Then, with the news of the investigation, as the person who had seen what nobody else had seen and built the case that brought it down. They were not effusive about it. These were not effusive people by temperament or tradition. But the quality of the attention changed. Men tipped their hats. Women stopped her to talk. At the general store, Margaret Howell began setting aside particular items she thought Eliza might need, a small courtesy that meant more than its literal components. At a community meeting in June, a water association meeting in Grayfield, the kind that had been announced on that board months ago, the kind she'd walked past when she'd first come to town, she was asked to speak about the underground channel and what its recovery meant for the broader region. She stood at the front of the room and spoke the way she did everything, directly, without performance, with the full confidence of someone who knows what she knows and has stopped apologizing for knowing it. Afterward, a man she didn't recognize came to speak to her. Older, gray-haired with the leathered face of someone who had spent decades outdoors. My daughter works a homestead 2 valleys east, he said. Been having water trouble for 2 years. I'd like her to talk to you. Tell her to come to Mercer Ranch, Eliza said. I'm there most days. He nodded. He started to leave, then stopped. Turned back. You're the one who figured out what Hale was doing, he said. Not as a compliment exactly, more as an establishing of fact. I'm the one who documented it, she said. A lot of people had pieces of it. They just needed someone to put the pieces in order. He looked at her for a moment with those outdoor weathered eyes. You're too modest, he said. I'm accurate, she said. There's a difference. His daughter came to the ranch the following week. She was not the last. The house had changed. Not dramatically. It was not a different house. But in the incremental accumulation of small things that happened when a place is being properly lived in. Curtains rehung. Floors that were clean and also warm. A kitchen that smelled like it was regularly used for something that mattered. A porch that had acquired 2 chairs, which had not been there before, positioned to look out over the north pasture and the ridge. On an evening in July, warm, the light lasting late the way summer light did in this country, the kind of evening that seemed to want to be stayed in, Ronan and Eliza sat on that porch after supper, in those chairs, with coffee cooling in their hands, and looked at the ranch. The herd was visible in the north pasture, larger than it had been in 3 years, moving in the easy, unhurried way of cattle that are healthy and have good grass and good water, and no particular complaint with the world. The stock pond caught the last light. The channel lines through the fields showed as slightly darker green against the general green, the water signature visible even from a distance. My grandfather would have liked you, Ronan said. She looked at him. He was looking out at the ranch, not at her, in the way of a man who says difficult things more easily when he doesn't have to watch them land. What makes you say that? He was a man who paid attention to what the land told him, Ronan said. He didn't believe in looking past things. Believed the information was always there if you were willing to receive it. He paused. He would have recognized that in you. She was quiet for a moment. The evening moved around them. The sound of cattle, the creek, the particular soft percussion of a ranch settling into its nighttime rhythms. My father would have liked this ranch, she said. He would have spent hours on the soil composition alone. Ronan smiled, a real smile this time, full and unguarded, the kind she had been watching work its way to the surface for months, like the water table coming up. It changed his face considerably. She had been quietly aware of this for some time. Tell me about him, Ronan said. Your father, you've told me pieces. Tell me more. So she did. She told him about James Hartwell and the homestead and the summer afternoons reading soil and the way he taught her that the land was always speaking and the only question was whether you were patient enough to listen. She told stories she hadn't told anyone in years, small stories, specific ones, the kind that carry the actual weight of a person rather than the summary of them. She talked until the coffee was cold and the light was gone and the stars had come out over the ridge in their full density, the way they came out in high country on clear summer nights. Ronan listened the whole way through. He asked questions, real questions, not polite ones, but the questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand the person who was speaking. She found herself answering with an openness that surprised her, that she would have armored against a year ago, that she allowed now because she had learned over 7 months on this particular land beside this particular man that some things are worth the vulnerability of being fully known. When she finished, they sat in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have said important things and do not need to fill the space afterward. Eliza, he said. She waited. I think you know what I want to say. I think I do, she said. And? She looked out at the ranch, at the water and the grass and the ridge and the cattle and the recovered, thriving, breathing land that they had held together through everything that had tried to unmake it. She looked at all of it, and she felt it, the thing that had hooked into her chest on that first night in the small room, the thing she hadn't had a name for then and had a name for now, the specific and powerful feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be. I came through that gate with nothing, she said. No family, no place, no claim on anything. She paused. I don't feel that way anymore. He turned to look at her. His expression in the starlight was completely open. You haven't felt that way for a while, he said. I've been watching. "You've always been watching," she said. "You've always been watching right back," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, simply and without qualification, "Yes." He reached across the space between the two chairs and covered her hand with his. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm, and it covered hers completely, and she turned her hand over and held it. They stayed like that, on the porch of the house that was theirs, looking out at the land that was alive again, while the stars turned slowly above the ridge in their ancient, unhurried way. The drought was done. The corruption was answered. The land held water, and water held life, and life held everything that had been worth fighting for. There was no single moment afterward that could be called the moment things were right. There were only the accumulated ordinary moments of a life that had found its shape, mornings at the kitchen table with maps and coffee and the easy conversation of two people making plans together, afternoons on horseback across pastures that were proving themselves season by season, evenings on the porch, watching the light change on the ridge that Eliza had looked at every day for 7 months and still found remarkable. The little room off the kitchen sat empty now. It had been turned into a proper storage room for the household records. The notebooks and documentation and property surveys that were the paper memory of everything that had happened and everything that was being built. She had organized it herself, carefully, the way she organized everything. On the cover of the first notebook, the one she had started on her 3rd day at the ranch, the one that had become the foundation of a federal case, she had written, in the same neat hand she'd used for everything inside it, a single line that she'd added some weeks after the investigation concluded, on a quiet afternoon when she'd been sorting the records and had paused at that first page. The land is never completely empty. You just have to know how to listen. She had not added a name below it. She didn't need to. She knew where the words had come from, and she knew what they had made possible, and she carried that knowledge the way she carried everything that mattered. Not on the surface, where it could be jostled, but deep, where it held. The ranch breathed in the clear Montana morning. The water moved beneath the earth and above it, following channels that had been restored to their purpose. The cattle moved through grass that was greener than it had been in a decade. The ridge to the east stood solid and permanent and lit by a sun that asked nothing of the land except to be itself. Eliza Hartwell stood at the gate of Mercer Ranch, the iron gate, the rusted design, the wooden sign burned deep enough to last, and looked out at everything that the land had been and was becoming. Behind her, she heard Ronan's boots on the porch, heard him come down the steps, heard him cross the yard with the familiar cadence that she knew as well as she knew the sound of the creek, or the movement of the horses, or the particular quality of wind before weather. He stopped beside her. They stood together at the gate and looked at the ranch. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the land that had been half dead when she'd arrived. She looked at the water and the grass and the ridge and the morning that was opening around them with the particular clarity of days that intend to be worth remembering. She had been overlooked her entire life. She had been the woman nobody saw coming, nobody thought worth watching, nobody expected to matter. She had walked through fire for animals that couldn't save themselves. She had walked through a gate with nothing but her father's eyes and her own stubborn refusal to look past what the land was telling her. She had built something from attention and patience and the willingness to stay when every previous version of her life had been about moving on. She was home. She was seen. She was, for the first time in 26 years, exactly where she chose to be. "Ready," she said, and they walked back through the gate together, into the land that was alive and waiting, into the morning that belonged to them. The end.